Defining the legal duty of care, Self-Chain TM Institute, the directive. This is the implementation series. This is Silence Screams Loud Strength, Season 9, the directive. Standards, compliance, participation, integrity, and remedy. In Episode 1, we are defining the legal duty of care. In Season 8, we expose the structural failures of safeguarding, participation disclosure, institutional accountability, and procedural integrity. Season 9 is different. This is not commentary. This is implementation, the implementation series. These episodes define the operational standards required to restore lawful safeguarding, meaningful participation, institutional integrity, and human protection. And we begin with the foundation of all lawful systems, duty. Because the modern safeguarding crisis is not simply a crisis of resources. It is not simply a crisis of training. It is not simply a crisis of policy. It is a crisis of operational duty. Institutes increasingly speak the language of safeguarding while failing to operationalize the legal obligation safeguarding actually requires. The result is a dangerous illusion. Systems appear compliant while vulnerable people remain unprotected. That distinction matters because the law does not ask whether an institute sounded compassionate. The law asks whether the institute discharged its duty. Self-Chain's position is clear. Safeguarding is not a public relations exercise. It is a legal, procedural, operational, and human obligation. And where that obligation exists, failure carries consequences. One of the greatest institutional distortions of the modern era is the confusion between policy and law. Policy is guidance. Law is obligation. Policy may recommend. Law compels. Policy can change internally. Law creates enforceable duty. Too many organizations rely on internal language, procedural templates, administrative pathways, and operational culture, while forgetting the central question: what does that law actually require? Because once the legal duty is identified, discretion narrows. And that is precisely why institutional systems often retreat into procedural ambiguity. Ambiguity protects systems. Clarity protects people. This episode, therefore, defines the legal architecture professionals are required to operate within when safeguarding vulnerable individuals. Not aspirational, no, operational. The legal duty of care does not emerge from statute alone. It emerges from the intersection of human rights, safeguarding legislation, equality obligations, public law principles, procedural fairness, professional regulations, and institutional accountability. The first foundation of the Human Rights Act 1998, Article 6, protects the right to a fair hearing. Article 8 protects private and family life, dignity, autonomy, identity, and the integrity of the home. Article 14 protects against discriminatory treatment in the application of rights. Protocol 1, Article 1 protects peaceful enjoyment of possessions. These are not symbolic principles. These are operational duties. A person cannot meaningfully exercise Article 6 rights if trauma, coercion, poverty, disability, fear, and procedural complexity or institutional conduct prevents them from participating effectively. A person cannot meaningfully exercise Article 8 rights if safeguarding systems expose them to ongoing abuse, unsafe housing, surveillance, intimidation, or institutional disregard. A person cannot meaningfully access justice where equality exists formally but not operationally. This is why participation matters, not theoretically. No, participation needs to be participation, meaningful participation. The Family Procedure Rules recognizes this directly. Part A and Practice Direction 3AA require the court to consider vulnerability and participation impairment. The rules recognize that the quality of evidence can be diminished by fear, trauma, abuse, coercive control, intimidation, or mental health distress. That means the system already understands something critically important here. A vulnerable person may appear less credible precisely because they have been harmed. That is not a weakness in the victim. It is a safeguarding issue that needs addressing. And where safeguarding issues are identified, institutes acquire obligations. So where safeguarding issues are identified, institutes acquire obligations, not suggestions, obligations. The Domestic Abuse Act 2021 further transformed the legal landscape by recognizing domestic abuse as more than physical violence. The law now explicitly recognizes coercive control, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, economic abuse, treatment, threatening behavior, and the controlling conduct. This matters enormously because institutes historically assessed harm through visible injury alone. Self-chain TM rejects that limitation. Control itself is harm. Economic dependence can be harm. Isolation can be harm. Procedural exhaustion can become harm. Housing insecurity can become harm. Institutional disbelief can become harm. And where institutes ignore these realities, they risk operationally reinforcing abuse rather than safeguarding against it. The Equality Act 2010 adds another layer of duty. Public authorities must comply with the public sector equality duty under Section 149. That means they must actively consider how their decisions affect vulnerable individuals, including those impacted by trauma, disability, mental distress, race, sex, or other protected characteristics. Equality is not achieved merely by applying the same process to everyone, because identical treatment inside an equal condition produces an equal outcome or outcomes. That is why procedural neutrality alone is insufficient. The Self-Chain T.M.'s position is this: a process cannot be considered fair if it ignores participation impairment. A process cannot be considered lawful if vulnerability is visible yet operationally disregarded. A process cannot be considered protective if the structure itself intensifies the person's disadvantage. This is where many systems fail. They confuse procedural completion with safeguarding success. Forms were completed, they say. Meetings occurred, they say. Policies were followed. Emails were sent. Boxes were ticked. But the person still remained unsafe. The person remained unheard. The person remained excluded. The person remained economically trapped. The person remained procedurally overwhelmed. That is not safeguarding. That is administrative performance. And administrative performance without human protection is operational failure. The Care Act 2014 further reinforces the safeguarding duty through Section 42 obligations. Where an adult has care and support needs, is experiencing or at risk of abuse or neglect, and cannot protect themselves, the authority must make safeguarding inquiries, not may, must. That distinction is critical. They must. Because safeguarding cannot operate through institutional convenience. The question is not, would intervention be difficult? The question is, does the legal threshold exist? If it does, duty activates. This is why Self-Chain repeatedly emphasizes operational integrity. A lawful safeguarding system must be capable of recognizing vulnerability, preserving participation, protecting evidence, reducing procedural disadvantage, identifying coercive control, escalating risk appropriately, recording concerns actively, and preventing institutional fragmentation. Because fragmentation itself becomes dangerous. Why? When housing does not speak to safeguarding, when safeguarding does not speak to legal services, when legal services do not speak to healthcare, when healthcare does not speak to the court, and when each institute operates in isolation, the vulnerable person becomes the carrier of the burden. The burden is they become responsible for stitching together their own protection while already traumatized. That is not a safeguarding framework. It is a systematic abandonment. The self-chain TM model, therefore, introduces a different principle, single truth architecture. A safeguarding system must reduce evidential discontinuity, not create it. The person should not have to repeatedly relieve trauma because institutes refuse interoperability. They should not have to restart, disclose every time a new department becomes involved. They should not have to prove vulnerability repeatedly to systems already in possession of evidence. That is operational inefficiency. But more importantly, it is human harm. Duty, therefore, extends beyond reaction. Duty includes design. An institute cannot claim to be safeguarding while operating structures that systematically exhaust participation, suppress disclosures, create confusion, prolong instability, or reward procedural aggression. That cannot be the safeguarding protocols. That is why governance matters. The legal duty of care is not fulfilled merely because no one intended harm or intended to harm the victim. Negligence does not require malice. Institutional failure does not require conspiracy. Sometimes systems become dangerous because they prioritize process over protection for too long. And once that culture embeds itself operationally, vulnerability and vulnerable people begin disappearing inside the procedure. This is why self-chain distinguishes between procedural functionality and safeguarding integrity. A process can function administratively while failing humanely. A system can appear orderly while producing injustice. A hearing can occur while participation remains unequal. A safeguarding referral can be logged while no meaningful protection follows. A homeless assessment can be completed while the person remains unsafe. A disclosure process can occur while assets remain concealed. The existence of process is not proof of integrity. The test is outcome. Did the system preserve dignity? Did the system preserve participation? Did the system preserve safety? Did the system reduce vulnerability? Did the system identify coercive control? Did the system prevent procedural exploitation? Did the system protect rights operationally, not symbolically? That is the legal standard institutes increasingly fail to measure themselves against. And that is why this season exists, because operational safeguarding requires more than awareness. It requires enforceable standards. The self-chain TM seal of integrity, therefore, establishes a clear threshold. An institute must be capable of demonstrating that its operational systems identify vulnerability, preserve participation, prevent evidential fragmentation, recognizes trauma, and reduces procedural inequality. It needs to protect human dignity across every stage of engagement, not theoretically, not rhetorical, no, operational. The future of safeguarding will not belong to institutes that merely sound compassionate. It will belong to institutes capable of proving integrity structurally, because modern risk is no longer simply individual. It is a systematic issue, and systems that fail repeatedly are not neutral. They become part of the harm. This is why defining duty matters, because once duty is identified clearly, accountability becomes measurable. Ambiguity protects systems. Clarity protects people. And the directive is designed to remove ambiguity. This has been episode 1 of season 9 of Silent Screams, Loud Strength, Unmasking Justice, defining the legal duty of care, part of the directive, standards, compliance, participation, integrity, and remedy. Written and delivered by Samantha. Self-chain institutes exist to change systems that do not work.